It started innocently enough. The house was buzzing with activity, preparing for what was supposed to be a special celebration. Susan, my wife, had been building up this moment for weeks, dropping hints about a surprise that would make this birthday unforgettable. Looking back, I realize how true that was, just not in the way I expected. We had a good life, or so I thought. A comfortable home, our daughter Emily was thriving at college, and while our marriage wasn't perfect, it had survived 2 decades. The little things, the drifting apart, the long silences, seemed normal for a couple that had been together for so long. We weren't the people we used to be, and I blamed it on the stress of my long work hours and her busy schedule with her online business. We didn't fight much, but we didn't talk much either. That Friday evening, I had no idea I was about to face a truth I'd never seen coming. I never imagined that the surprise Susan had hinted at wasn't the one she had planned, but rather the ugly revelation that would turn my world upside down. What I thought was a celebration would become the night my life unraveled in ways I couldn't have dreamed of. By the end of it, everything I believed in, my marriage, my family, was in ruins. If only I had noticed the signs. But now it's too late, and this is the story of how everything I thought was solid came crashing down. You won't believe how it all unfolded. That evening, as Emily's friends showed up to help with the last bits of party prep, I went to answer the door. Standing there, grinning like they were running the place, were Jason and 2 of his buddies, Mike and Ryan. "Hey, Mr. Davis." Jason greeted me, wearing that same smug smile that always grated on me. "Ready for the best birthday ever?" I forced a smile, trying to tamp down the irritation I always felt around him. "Yeah, thanks for helping out," I said, stepping aside to let them in. "Emily's in the back getting the decorations set up. Go give her a hand." They strolled past, laughing and joking among themselves. As they walked away, I caught a bit of their conversation, Jason's voice, loud and cocky as usual. "Man, Mrs. Davis is still looking good. I can't believe she's..." I froze. My stomach dropped, and my head felt hot. Were they really talking about Susan? My wife? Before I could make sense of it, Mike nudged Jason, saying something I didn't quite catch, and they both broke into laughter. I balled my fists, my gut instinct screaming at me to go after them and teach them some respect. But I didn't. Instead, I took a deep breath, trying to keep myself in check. They were just dumb kids, I told myself. Immature, thoughtless kids. Still, the disrespect ate at me. Once they were out of sight, I headed into the kitchen where Susan was already busy preparing food for the next day's celebration. I walked up to Susan, still trying to keep my cool, though I could feel the frustration bubbling up inside me. "You won't believe what I just overheard," I muttered, doing my best to keep my voice down. "Chloe's friends were talking about you, about how attractive you are. Can you believe that?" Susan looked up at me, clearly surprised at first, but then her expression shifted to this amused little smirk. "Oh, come on," she said, brushing it off. "They're just boys. They don't mean anything by it." That wasn't what I wanted to hear. Shaking my head, I felt my irritation flare up even more. "It's disrespectful, Susan. They're in our house, talking about you like that. I don't want to hear that kind of crap again." She sighed, giving me a playful nudge like she always did when she was trying to lighten the mood. "Relax, Dan. They're harmless." I didn't push the issue. Instead, I walked away, still feeling uneasy, but I made up my mind not to let it mess up the night. I had more important things to think about, like enjoying my birthday. But deep down, that uneasy feeling clung to me, like some kind of warning I couldn't fully understand. The next day, the house was completely decked out. Streamers hung everywhere, and the smell of barbecue filled the whole place. Laughter echoed from the backyard as friends and family started trickling in. Everything seemed perfect. Susan was right there beside me, flashing that bright, welcoming smile of hers, charming everyone the way she always did. Chloe and her friends, Jason, Mike, Ryan, and the rest, were busy mingling with the guests, helping out and keeping the energy up. Still, there was something gnawing at me. It wasn't just Jason's cocky smirk or the way he always seemed to hover around Susan. It was more than that, an edge to the whole day that didn't feel quite right. But I kept telling myself I was overthinking it. After all, it was my birthday, and I was surrounded by everyone I cared about. What could possibly go wrong? As the evening went on, people toasted, laughed, and feasted. I did my best to soak it all in, enjoying the attention and the good vibes. But then something odd happened. While I was weaving my way through the crowd, I noticed Susan quietly slipping away from the group, and right behind her were Chloe's friends. I watched them head inside the house, disappearing down the hallway. My stomach twisted into knots. What were they up to? I tried to come up with some reasonable explanation, but none of it added up. It was just Susan and a bunch of college guys, heading upstairs, toward our bedroom. My heart started racing, and before I knew it, I was following them, my pulse pounding in my ears with every step. When I reached our bedroom door, I hesitated. I could hear muffled voices, some laughter, and the distinct sound of things being moved around. My mind went into overdrive, imagining all sorts of scenarios. What could they possibly be doing in there? I stood frozen outside the door, my hand hovering over the knob. The voices grew clearer, and I could hear Susan's laughter mixing with theirs. That's when it hit me, this wasn't just in my head. Something was happening, something I wasn't ready for. But I couldn't just walk away. Not now. I had to know. I reached for the door, bracing myself for whatever was on the other side. And then I made up my mind. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the sound barely audible over the low voices and muffled laughter inside. My heart was pounding in my chest, my mouth dry as the desert. I stepped into the room, and what I saw stopped me cold, like the air had been sucked right out of the room. There they were, Jason, Mike, Ryan, and a couple of other guys I didn't recognize. All of them were gathered around Susan, my wife. She was right in the center of it all, naked, tangled up with these boys, the same boys who'd been decorating for my birthday just hours earlier. My mind couldn't make sense of what was happening. I stood there in the doorway, frozen in place, completely numb. They didn't even notice me at first. The room was filled with a disgusting mix of moans, laughter, and crude comments. Their hands were all over her like they had no shame, no decency. And Susan, my Susan, was right there with them, laughing along like it was some kind of joke. The woman I'd been married to for 20 years, the mother of my daughter, was gone, lost in this twisted, nightmarish scene. I don't remember exactly when I started screaming. Maybe it was when the horror of it all finally sank in, or maybe it was the pure rage that had been boiling inside me. All I know is that I let out a scream so loud it shook the walls. "What the hell are you doing?" Everything stopped. Susan turned toward me, her smile vanishing in an instant, replaced by shock. The guys froze too, startled by my sudden appearance. For a second, there was silence, a horrible, suffocating silence. And then, everything exploded into chaos. I didn't think. I couldn't think. The only thing I knew was that I had to destroy something, anything, to release the anger that was tearing me apart. My hand grabbed the nearest thing, a heavy old landline phone that had been sitting on the nightstand for years. With a roar, I swung it at the closest person, which just so happened to be Jason. The crack of plastic against bone was sickening. Jason stumbled back, clutching his head, yelling in pain. That arrogant smirk of his. Gone, replaced by sheer terror. "You bastards!" I screamed, swinging the phone again. This time, Ryan barely managed to dodge as I aimed for him. The room spiraled into chaos. They were yelling, scrambling to get away, but I wasn't about to stop. The rage inside me was like something out of a nightmare, fueled by a betrayal so deep, it made me feel like a different person. Something monstrous. I managed to land a hit on Mike's shoulder, sending him crashing into the wall. But before I could go after him again, they regrouped. There were 5 of them, 5 against 1. They were younger, stronger, and now angrier that I had gotten the jump on them. Jason recovered quickly, grabbing hold of my arm before I could swing again. Mike and Ryan joined in, wrestling me down to the ground. The phone slipped from my grip as fists started raining down on me. But I wasn't giving up. I fought back with everything I had, wild punches, desperate to break free, to claw my way out from under them. I managed to land a solid punch on one of the guys, and I heard the satisfying crack as my fist connected with his nose. Blood spurted everywhere, and he stumbled back with a groan. But the victory was short-lived. Before I knew it, the others had me pinned to the ground, my arms forced down. I could taste blood in my mouth, that metallic tang mixing with the sweat and fury rushing through me. Every part of my body screamed in agony as they kicked and punched me. I felt something give, maybe a rib, but I didn't care. The physical pain was nothing compared to the rage roaring inside me. Somehow, I managed to break free, scrambling to my feet. I stumbled toward the door, barely able to see straight, my vision blurry and my head pounding. It wasn't thought that drove me anymore, it was pure survival. I had to get out before they finished me off. Leaning against the hallway wall for support, I kept moving, my body trembling with the effort. I could hear them shouting from the room behind me, but I didn't stop. I stumbled down the stairs, gasping for air, every breath sharp and painful. That's when the noise from upstairs finally reached the guests. The party, once filled with laughter, fell silent as people began to realize something was wrong. I collapsed in the middle of the living room, blood dripping from my nose and mouth, my clothes torn and bloodied. Bruises were already forming across my arms and chest. Suddenly, I saw Chloe. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with confusion and fear as she rushed toward me. "Dad, what happened? Are you okay?" Her voice trembled as she tried to help me to my feet, but I could barely move. I wanted to warn her, to tell her to stay away, but the words wouldn't come. Then she saw it. Behind me, coming down the stairs, was Susan, her mother, disheveled, flushed, and half-naked. Following her were Jason, Mike, Ryan, and the other guys, looking just as messed up as she did. Chloe's face changed, her eyes widening in shock as the reality of what she was seeing hit her like a freight train. "Mom!" Her voice cracked, a mix of disbelief and disgust. "What the hell is going on?" Susan froze at the bottom of the stairs, her face draining of color as the full weight of the situation hit her. She looked at Chloe, then at me, clearly scrambling for some kind of explanation. But what could she possibly say? The damage was already done. There was no going back. The room fell into a suffocating silence. Everyone, friends, family, stood there in shock, eyes fixed on Susan, on my wife, standing there half-dressed with a bunch of college kids who were barely older than our daughter. Chloe's gaze bounced between me and her mother, her face twisting with confusion and rage. "Dad, why, did you?" she began, but her voice broke off, her eyes brimming with tears as she stepped back, shaking her head in disbelief. "Mom, what did you do?" Her voice cracked again, the heartbreak clear. I didn't have the strength to say anything. There were no words to make sense of what had just happened. All I could do was watch, aching from head to toe, as my entire world shattered before me in slow motion. The guests began murmuring among themselves, the whispers growing louder, everyone trying to make sense of the disaster unfolding in front of them. And then, finally, someone spoke up, cutting through the tension. "Mark, what the hell is going on?" One of my friends stepped forward, his face etched with confusion and disbelief. His voice was filled with both concern and confusion as he called out to me. I forced myself to sit up, struggling to catch my breath, my body aching and broken. Wiping the blood from my face, I croaked, "Call the police." The words barely made it out of my mouth, hoarse and weak, but they were enough. "Call the police," I repeated, a bit louder this time. Suddenly, the room erupted into a frenzy. People fumbled for their phones, some shouting, some whispering, but I just sat there, staring at the wreckage of my life. Susan stood frozen, her eyes darting between Chloe and me. It was as if the weight of everything she'd done was just starting to settle on her. I turned my gaze to her, my voice cracked and raw. "We're done, Susan. You're finished." Her face twisted, but not with shame. It wasn't remorse that washed over her, it was rage. Pure, unfiltered rage. "You son of a b*************, she spat, her eyes wild. "You're nothing without me. Nothing." I didn't respond. I had no fight left in me. My body was beaten down, and so was everything I'd ever believed in. All I could do was sit there, watching as the chaos swirled around us, waiting for the nightmare to finally end. As the weight of the evening settled in, the room fell into a strange kind of stillness. The air was thick with shock, and it felt like time had stopped for everyone inside that house. I slowly pulled myself up from the floor, every muscle aching, my head pounding from the beating I'd taken. The guests looked at me, wide-eyed and horrified, whispering amongst themselves. They didn't know what to do, how could they? Who would ever expect something like this at a birthday party? Their stares cut through me like knives. Pity, disgust, confusion, they all swirled together in their eyes. But none of that mattered anymore. I knew what I had to do. "Everyone out," I rasped, my voice barely above a whisper. But then, something inside me reignited, fueled by the burning rage still smoldering deep down. "Now. Everybody out." My voice came out stronger this time. People scrambled, gathering their things, their faces pale, their movements hurried. Some murmured apologies, some couldn't even look me in the eye. But I didn't care. I didn't need their pity or their apologies. I just needed them gone. The fewer witnesses to this disaster, the better. Once the last guest slipped out the door, I slammed it shut and locked it. I stood there for a moment, leaning my forehead against the door, trying to catch my breath. My entire body ached. My ribs felt like they were on fire, and my vision was still blurred from the hits I'd taken to the head. But none of that physical pain came close to the agony I felt inside. The woman I had loved for so long, the mother of my child, had torn everything apart. She had ruined us, ruined everything we had built. I turned to face Susan. She hadn't moved. She stood there at the bottom of the stairs, barely clothed, her face a twisted mix of fear and fury. Behind her, Chloe stood frozen, tears streaming down her face, her expression one of utter disbelief and heartbreak. My chest tightened at the sight of her. Chloe shouldn't have seen any of this. No child should ever witness their world being shattered like that. None of this should have happened. "I'm calling the police," I said, my voice steady now, the anger replacing the numbness and shock. "You're what?" Susan snapped, taking a step forward, her face twisting in disbelief. "Don't be ridiculous, Mark. Don't make this worse than it already is." "Worse?" I let out a bitter, hollow laugh, the sound scraping at my throat. "Worse?" I repeated, staring at Susan in disbelief. "You destroyed everything. You let those kids do that to you, right here in our home. It's over, Susan. We're done." My voice cracked with the weight of it all, but I stood my ground, forcing myself to stand tall despite the pain throbbing through every inch of my body. Susan's face changed, the shock fading away, replaced by something darker, cold, almost calculating. She crossed her arms and sneered at me. "You think you can just throw me out, Mark? You think you have that kind of power? You're pathetic. You've always been pathetic. Even after everything, after what I had just witnessed, there she was, angry at me. It was like I didn't know her anymore. The woman I thought I loved, the mother of my daughter, had vanished. All that was left was this cold, heartless person I barely recognized. Ignoring her, I reached for the phone, my hands shaking as I dialed the police. Chloe still stood there, silent, her face a mask of shock and disbelief. She couldn't process the depths of her mother's betrayal. I waited for the line to connect, feeling Susan's icy gaze on me the entire time, watching me like she was daring me to go through with it. The police didn't take long to arrive. As they walked into the house, their faces grew serious, taking in the scene. There I stood, bruised and bloodied, barely able to stay on my feet. I explained everything to them, my voice cold and detached as I recounted the horrific events from upstairs. I told them about the assault, the betrayal, everything. The officers scribbled down notes, their eyes shifting between me, Susan, and the college boys who were still lingering around like they had no idea what to do next. The boys were taken into custody without much resistance. Dylan, of course, tried to act tough, muttering some weak insults as they cuffed him, but even he knew he was out of his depth. The cocky smirk was gone, and all that was left was the realization that there was no way out of this. Susan stood off to the side, her arms crossed, glaring at me like I was the one at fault. She didn't offer a word in her defense, no apologies, no explanations. Just that bitter, hateful stare as they cuffed her too. Before they let her out, I met her gaze one last time. "I'm filing for divorce," I said, my voice steady even though my chest felt like it was about to cave in. "We're finished. You'll never see me or Chloe again." For a brief moment, I thought I saw something flicker in her eyes, guilt, maybe even regret. But it disappeared just as quickly, replaced by a fiery hatred that sent a chill through me. "You're making a mistake, Mark," she hissed, venom dripping from every word. "You think you're going to come out on top? You think you can just throw me away like this? You don't know who you're dealing with. You're finished, Mark. Do you hear me? You're nothing." The officers led her out the door, her words still hanging in the air. And as I watched her leave, a strange sense of relief washed over me. It was finally over. All the lies, all the deceit, all the poison that had seeped into our marriage, it was gone. Or at least, I thought it was. The next morning, I woke up sore and beaten, but determined. I had barely slept that night. My mind raced, trying to piece together the shattered fragments of my life. Every part of me hurt, physically and emotionally, but I knew what I had to do. This was the start of something new. Something without Susan. Something without the lies. But I couldn't shake the feeling that even though Susan was gone, the nightmare wasn't quite over. Chloe had gone to stay with a friend, and I spent the night alone in what was now just my house. My house. The emptiness of it was unsettling. I was still trying to make sense of everything that had happened when a loud knock at the door startled me. Then came another, more forceful this time. I dragged myself over, each step reminding me of the beating I'd taken the night before. When I opened the door, I was met by a group of men. There were 5 or 6 of them, all rough-looking, built like they'd been lifted right out of some back-alley brawl. These weren't locals. I didn't recognize a single face, but something about them told me they weren't the type of people you forgot. One of them, a tall guy with a shaved head and a wicked scar running across his cheek, stepped forward. "You Mark?" His voice was gruff, like gravel being ground underfoot. "Yeah," I replied, feeling the bottom drop out of my stomach. "Who the hell are you?" He smiled, but it was a cold, twisted smile, one that made my skin crawl. "You pissed off the wrong people, Mark." Before I could process what was happening, they were on me. Fists flew, hard and fast. I didn't stand a chance. The first punch dropped me to the floor, and the next few moments were a blur of pain. They didn't hold back. Every blow was brutal, driving into me like they were trying to break more than just my bones. I tried to fight back, but I was already weak from the night before. These guys were professionals, hitters, no doubt. I felt my ribs crack under their relentless assault, my vision swam, and every hit sent shockwaves of agony through my body. Blood filled my mouth, the world spinning as I struggled to stay conscious. But I refused to pass out. Not like this. When they finally stopped, I lay there, gasping for air, every inch of me battered and broken. I could barely move, my body a crumpled mess on the floor. One of them crouched down beside me, his face cold and unfeeling. "Consider this a warning," he said, his voice low and menacing. "You stay out of Linda's way. You file those divorce papers, you press charges, you even think about making trouble for her, we'll be back. And next time, you won't get off so easy." I barely registered the words as they left, the door slamming behind them. I lay there, staring up at the ceiling, my body too broken to move. Linda had done this. She had set these guys on me. I had no idea she was connected to people like that, people who could kill me if they wanted. I'd spent 20 years with her, thinking I knew her, but I was wrong. I had no idea who she really was. And now I was paying the price. The house was eerily silent after they left, but the echoes of their threats still rang in my ears. I lay on the cold floor for what felt like hours, every breath painful, every inch of me throbbing with bruises and broken bones. The pain was unbearable, but the humiliation was worse. My life, my marriage, my reputation, my safety, had been shattered in just 2 days. Linda, the woman I had built a life with, wasn't just someone who had betrayed me. She was someone dangerous, connected to people who could kill me if they wanted to. I had no idea what kind of past she had hidden from me all these years. And now, because of her, I was lying here on the floor, a broken man in more ways than one. Eventually, I managed to pull myself up, every movement sending sharp stabs of pain through my body. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do next. The police weren't going to help. They had seen what happened yesterday, but they didn't know who they were dealing with. These men weren't just some thugs. They were professionals, and they had connections. I was on my own now, and I had no idea where to turn. This went far beyond just some affair. Linda had connections, criminal ones. Those guys that showed up, they weren't just there by coincidence. She had sent them to protect herself, to make sure I didn't fight back. And as much as I wanted to, I knew I couldn't go up against something like that blindly. I needed more information. I had to know exactly who I was dealing with. That's when I decided to hire a private detective. There wasn't any other option. The next morning, still sore and bruised from the beating, I made the call. My body felt wrecked, but my mind was sharp, driven by pure rage and determination. I wasn't going to sit here and let Linda destroy what was left of my life. I needed answers, and I needed someone who could dig up the past I had been blind to for years. The detective's name was Harris. He came recommended by an old friend, a grizzled, no-nonsense type who had seen it all. When he showed up at my door, he took one look at me and raised an eyebrow. "You look like you've been through hell," he said, his voice gravelly as he stepped inside, glancing around at the wreckage of what was once my home. I let out a dry laugh, wincing as it sent a sharp pain through my ribs. "You have no idea." We sat down, and I spilled everything. The affair, the college kids, the brutal beating, and the gang that came after me. I laid it all out there, every last detail, even though each word felt like twisting the knife in my own chest. Harris listened, nodding occasionally as he took notes, his expression never changing. "So," he said when I was done, "you're thinking your wife's tied up with some dangerous people, and she sent them to make sure you didn't take this any further?" I nodded, feeling a bitter taste in my mouth. "They said they'd come back if I pressed charges or filed for divorce." Harris leaned back in his chair, rubbing his stubbled jaw. "And you've got no clue what she's involved in? Nothing from her past that seems out of place?" Nothing, I said, shaking my head. I don't know who the hell she is anymore. He sighed, pulling a pack of cigarettes from his coat. Well, looks like we're gonna have to dig deep. I'll start by looking into her past, old records, contacts, anything that might give us a lead. But I'll warn you, Mark, if she's tied up with serious criminals, this could get real ugly. It's already ugly, I muttered, feeling utterly drained. Do whatever it takes. I need to know. The days that followed were quiet, but they were filled with a constant, underlying tension. I kept my head down, doing my best to avoid running into any more of the people Linda had sent after me. Chloe stayed with her friend, refusing to come home. She couldn't even look at me after everything that had happened. I didn't blame her. Her mother had shattered both of us, and the shame was too much for Chloe to handle. Meanwhile, Harris was out there, working in the shadows, piecing together the puzzle of Linda's hidden life. It didn't take him long to uncover what I had feared. Linda had a past, a dark one that went back much further than I ever could have imagined. She had been involved with some shady characters in her younger days. These were men who operated on the fringes of society, trafficking drugs, laundering money, and doing God knows what else. She had cleaned up her act, at least, that's what I'd thought, when we met. But it turned out, those old ties had never really disappeared. She's in deep, Harris told me over the phone one evening. His tone was heavy, the kind of weight that only comes with bad news. There's a lot of stuff buried in her past, Mark, but what's clear is that she knows some very dangerous people. People who don't hesitate to do favors for old friends, like sending a gang of thugs to beat you up. She's not just playing house anymore. She's gone back to whatever life she had before. That was the final straw. It couldn't get any worse, I thought. But then it did. Harris called me again one afternoon, his voice unusually tense. Mark, you're not going to like this, he said. I've been tracking her movements, and it looks like she's stolen a good chunk of money from your joint accounts. A sizable sum. She's gone. I felt the bottom drop out of my world. My stomach twisted in knots as I realized I hadn't even thought to check our accounts. I had been so caught up in surviving the chaos day by day, I hadn't seen this coming. Now, Linda had drained the accounts and disappeared, leaving me with nothing. My financial security, the one thing I had left, was gone. Do you know where she went? I asked, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. Harris paused on the other end of the line. I've got a lead. She's been spotted heading toward the woods on the outskirts of town. But there's something else. Word is, she's been meeting with some old contacts, people who might be dealing drugs. It's not just about the money, Mark. She's desperate. That evening, we tracked her down. Harris and I drove out to a remote area, deep in the woods just outside the city. It was a place I had never been before, an old, abandoned stretch of forest where no one would go unless they had something to hide. The trees towered above us, casting long, ominous shadows as we pulled up. The only sound was the crunch of gravel under the tires. Stay here, Harris said, gripping his camera tightly. I'll get some footage. We need solid evidence if we're going to use this against her. I nodded and stayed in the car, my heart pounding as he slipped into the trees, disappearing into the dark woods. I sat there, thoughts racing, my stomach churning with anxiety. Linda, the woman I thought I knew, was out there somewhere, tangled up in God knows what. After what felt like hours, Harris returned, his expression grim. She's out there with some guys. Looks like she's trying to score something, drugs, most likely. I got it all on tape. I glanced nervously toward the woods, my breath catching in my throat. What now? We get out of here, he said, his voice firm. We've got enough. Let's go. As we started to pull away, I saw something move in the trees, a flash of motion. Then, suddenly, she appeared. Linda burst out from the tree line, wild-eyed and frantic. Her clothes were a mess, her hair tangled and disheveled. She spotted the car and sprinted toward us, her voice rising into a desperate scream. "Mark, you bastard! Get back here! You can't leave me, Mark!" Her screams echoed through the forest, but Harris didn't slow down. He floored the gas, the car jolting forward as we sped down the dirt road. I looked back through the rearview mirror, watching her chase after us, her figure growing smaller with every second. She kept running, screaming my name, until she became nothing more than a speck in the distance. As the car roared down the road, I couldn't shake the image of her, wild, desperate, and utterly lost. The woman I had once loved was gone, replaced by someone I didn't recognize. Someone dangerous. Someone who would do anything to survive, even if it meant dragging me down with her. But I was done being dragged down. I was free now, or at least, I was getting there. I couldn't believe it. The woman I'd spent 2 decades with, the one I thought I knew so well, had become a complete stranger, someone unrecognizable. Linda wasn't just a liar or a cheater. She was a criminal, someone who had been living a dark, twisted life right under my nose. The silence in the car was suffocating, as if the weight of everything was pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. I had the evidence now, enough to take to the police, enough to put an end to all of this. But as I stared out at the darkening sky, all I could feel was an overwhelming sense of loss. My life had been torn apart, shattered beyond recognition. Linda had destroyed everything, and I wasn't sure if I'd ever be able to pick up the pieces. The further we drove from that forest, the more distant everything seemed, the years I'd spent with her, the life we built, the memories I once held dear. It was all slipping away, leaving behind a sickening emptiness. The woman I had loved for over 20 years had been gone long before I even realized it. She had been replaced by a stranger, a woman with secrets darker than I could have ever imagined. As Harris drove, I tried to make sense of the chaos in my head. But there was no making sense of it. Not now, and maybe not ever. Linda had been hiding so much from me, her past, her criminal connections, and now, her addiction. For years, I had convinced myself that we were just going through a rough patch, that we were drifting apart like many couples do after so long. But the truth? The truth was far worse. She had been living a double life, and I had been blind to it. Harris finally broke the silence, his voice rough but steady. "We've got enough evidence to put her away for a long time, Mark. The tape, the money she stole, the drugs. We'll take this to the police, and they'll handle it. You don't have to worry about her anymore." I nodded, though the relief didn't wash over me the way I had hoped. Yeah, you're right. But even as I said it, part of me couldn't quite grasp how far things had gone. I had always thought betrayal meant someone seeking comfort in someone else's arms. A fling. An affair. Painful, yes, but understandable. But this? This was different. It was the destruction of everything I believed in. Everything I had built. Linda's lies had cut deep, and I wasn't sure if I'd ever fully recover. The next morning, Harris and I went to the police. We handed over everything, footage of Linda making the deal in the woods, the drugs, the stolen money trail from our joint accounts. There was no doubt anymore. She wasn't just having an affair. She was caught up in something much bigger, much darker. The officers were thorough, nodding as they reviewed the evidence. They were calm and professional, but I could see the looks exchanged between them. They knew they were dealing with something serious. Linda wasn't just a lost wife or a misguided woman who had made a mistake. She was a part of a criminal underworld I hadn't even known existed. As we left the station, I expected to feel some kind of closure, but instead, I felt hollow. The truth was out, but it didn't make the pain any less real. Linda had betrayed me, not just as a wife, but as a person. Everything I had believed in for the past 20 years had been a lie. And now, as I stood on the other side of that truth, I wasn't sure what was left of me. But one thing was certain. She was gone for good now, and I had to figure out how to rebuild from the wreckage she left behind. The detectives we spoke to acted quickly, as if they had seen stories like this unfold countless times, people falling into the underworld, all while their families remained blissfully unaware. Linda was no exception. By that evening, they had arrested her. The police found her holed up in some rundown motel on the outskirts of town. She had drugs on her, enough to charge her with possession with intent to distribute. I was sitting in the empty living room, the silence of the house echoing around me, when the detective called. "She's in custody," he said, his voice clipped and professional. "Looks like she's been using for a while, Mark. We found more than just a small stash on her. She's deep into this." "I'm sorry." The words hit me harder than I expected, like a punch straight to the gut. I had suspected something like this, but hearing it confirmed, it was worse than I'd imagined. Linda wasn't just mixed up with criminals, she was a drug addict. All that time, while I was working long hours to keep us afloat, she was sinking deeper into a life I knew nothing about. I hung up the phone and sat there, staring at the walls of the home we had built together. Everything felt hollow. The life I thought I had, the life we had shared, felt like an illusion, a fragile house of cards that had collapsed in one brutal, swift moment. I could hardly recognize it anymore. The legal process moved quickly after that. Linda didn't stand a chance against the charges. Between the drugs, the money she had stolen, and all the evidence Harris had collected, there was no way out for her. She was going away for a long time. As for the boys, the ones who had turned my birthday into a nightmare, they didn't get off without consequences either. The police charged them with contributing to the delinquency of an adult, and though the charges weren't as serious as Linda's, they were hit with massive fines. They weren't innocent, not by a long shot, but the weight of the blame fell squarely on Linda's shoulders. I remember seeing Dylan in court, that cocky smirk wiped clean from his face. He didn't have anything to say when he stood before the judge. Neither did Eric or Jake. They were just scared kids now, caught up in something far bigger than they had ever anticipated. None of them looked smug anymore. As for Linda, she never showed me a shred of remorse. At least, not that I ever saw. I didn't go to her hearings. I didn't need to hear whatever pitiful excuses she might have tried to offer. The woman I had known was gone, replaced by someone I didn't recognize, and I had no interest in speaking to the stranger she had become. Weeks passed, and the house felt unbearably empty. It was like it didn't even belong to me anymore. Without Linda, without Chloe, it was just walls and silence. Chloe stayed away, still crashing at her friend's place. I knew she was too shocked, too hurt to face what her mother had done, and I couldn't blame her. What Linda had done wasn't just a betrayal of me, it was a betrayal of Chloe too, and that wound was far deeper than I could ever reach. I tried to move on, but the quiet in the house was a constant reminder of what had been lost. Every day, it felt like I was walking through the ruins of a life I thought I knew, unsure of how to rebuild. I didn't know how to deal with it myself. Some nights, I'd find myself pacing through the house, moving from room to room, as if retracing my steps could somehow reveal where everything had gone wrong. But no matter how much I thought about it, there were no answers. No clues to make sense of the chaos that had become my life. I thought about the early years with Linda, when everything was simple. We were young, in love, and building a future together. Back then, I thought we had it all figured out, that we were solid. But maybe I'd been fooling myself all along. There were probably signs, small, subtle hints, that I had brushed off as normal marital bumps in the road. Things I chose to ignore because I didn't want to believe they could lead to something so devastating. But now, looking back, I realized how blind I'd been to who she really was. The woman I thought I knew was someone else entirely, someone who had hidden her true self behind a mask for years. The day the divorce was finalized was the first time I felt any real sense of closure. Linda was gone for good, locked up, out of my life. The paperwork itself felt strangely simple. A few signatures, a few legal steps, and just like that, 2 decades of marriage, of shared memories, love, and betrayal, was reduced to a few sheets of paper. I walked out of the lawyer's office feeling lighter, but the weight of everything that had happened still pressed down on me. It wasn't something I could simply shake off. The damage was deep, and I knew it would take time to heal. But there was something else, too, something I hadn't felt in a long time. A small sense of hope. It was fragile, barely there, but it existed. A whisper that maybe, just maybe, I could rebuild from the wreckage. That evening, I sat on the porch, watching the sun sink behind the trees. For the first time in months, I allowed myself to really breathe. It wasn't over yet. There was still a long road ahead of me, and I knew that the scars Linda had left behind, on me, on Chloe, would take time to heal. I didn't know if Chloe would ever fully recover from the pain her mother had inflicted on her, or if I would ever trust anyone again. But for the first time, the weight of Linda's betrayal wasn't suffocating me. She was gone. The lies were gone. And sitting there, as the day slowly faded, I let that small flicker of hope grow a little brighter. I had survived the worst of it. And now, maybe, just maybe, I could start to recover.